Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this meeting on short notice. We are very happy that you're able to participate. In particular, I want to thank our panelists. We have a few adjustments on the panel, but we're going to have a great discussion today as we discuss the matter of Ukraine. So from all over the world, wherever you're coming from, thank you so very much for respecting us by your presence. So this event is organized by the University of Johannesburg, in particular, the Institute for the Future of Knowledge, where I'm the director and professor. Why are we having this meeting? We're trying to understand a few things. We're saying, why is there a war in Ukraine? So hopefully our panelists can give us a sense of what went wrong. Was it avoidable? Was it inevitable? Right now, as we speak, is there escalation or deterrent? What can be done to stop the war right now and save lives? What is the impact of this war on the BRICS alliance, on Africa, and on other people across the world? These are the issues we hope somehow our panelists will be able to help us think through. We are the Institute for the Future of Knowledge at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. We seek to create new knowledge, generate novel thought leadership, and with this webinar, we are asking the question, given the war in Ukraine, what are the lessons in handling global affairs? What is the future of diplomacy? Those are our concerns at the University of Johannesburg, in particular in our Future of Diplomacy research group. We are asking, what is the meaning of realpolitik and what are its implications? In international relations, what happens when there is a conflict between rights of states and international law on one end and strategic interests of states on the other side? Which side wins when we have that conflict? I hope that our panelists will shed some light on those issues. Are there on morality and ethics in international relations? Or is it just about interests of states? Is the Monroe Doctrine, which talks about spheres of influence, still valid as a framework? If it's not longer valid, what has replaced it? What rules govern nuclear power politics? We are searching for knowledge at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. What is the history of and what are the lessons from military conflicts between nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers? The case of Afghanistan, the case of Iraq, the case of Libya, the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and now Ukraine. What are the lessons that we can pick up in terms of conflict between nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers? Nuclear deterrence, mutual assured destruction. What does this mean? What roles do these two concepts play in our understanding of the war in Ukraine? What is the import of Article 5 of the NATO agreement, in particular when it comes to the membership of Ukraine in NATO? What is the rationale of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, when MED and ND, mutually assured destruction, have utility for some nations? We hope some of these issues will be addressed by our panelists. Is national sovereignty absolute? If it's not, why not? Does might make right? And why is this the case? For the international courts, criminal courts, why do nuclear powers get a pass? Not a single citizen, soldier, or leader of a nuclear power has been charged with war crimes, much less convicted. Why is this the case? Is it possible to craft and develop global diplomacy with less duplicity, less deception, less double standards, and less unethical conduct by states? We are searching for new knowledge. In summary, this is the framework for us in Johannesburg. This is the framework for us at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge, we must understand history. We must understand international relations. We must understand realpolitik. Thereafter, do scenario planning, strategic thinking around matters like mutually assured destruction, matters like nuclear deterrence. That way we can craft the future of diplomacy. Diplomacy must be reimagined. We need new thought leadership. We need new ideas. And so the emphasis we are saying is that history is important. The history of Ukraine, the history of Russia, the history of the Soviet Union, the history of conflicts. A page of history is worth 10 volumes of logic. Let us begin the discussion. We are the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. We seek to create new knowledge and novel thought leadership. With this webinar, we are asking, as I've said, that given the war in Ukraine, what is the future of diplomacy? It is our hope that our distinguished panelists, as they address this topic, Russia-Ukraine crisis, escalation or deterrent, they will be able to assist us in our journey to the future of diplomacy. I hand over to Professor Susie Graham, who is going to be our chairperson for this seminar. I thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mutambara. I appreciate that introduction to today's event. I'd also like to welcome the three panelists who will be sharing their thoughts with us today. Thank you very much for being with us. We have an adjusted panel, as Prof mentioned, but we're going to move ahead and hopefully still manage to have a meaningful engagement on this very important subject. And so I'd just like to briefly introduce the three panelists in terms of a biography. So we will hear firstly from Ambassador Ilya Rogachev, who is the Russian ambassador to South Africa. He previously served as Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations and Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN Security Council between 2004 and 2009. Welcome, Ambassador. We will also be hearing from Ambassador Stephen Pifer, who is William J. Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, Stanford University, California, the United States. He previously served as US Ambassador to Ukraine, 1998 to 2000, and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council between 1996 and 1997. Welcome, Ambassador Pifer. And lastly, we will hear from Professor David Marples, who is a distinguished university professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta. He's the author of 16 single-authored books, including The Collapse of the Soviet Union, 1985 to 1991, Russia in the 20th Century, The Quest for Stability, and Understanding Ukraine and Belarus. Welcome, Prof. Marples. So we will begin with the ambassador, who will present for 15 minutes, Ambassador. I'll let you know when you have 1 minute left in your presentation. We will then move on to the second two panelists, who will have 10 minutes each. And then we will open up for Q&A, which will be now an extended Q&A session with the audience. And we have 91 attendees, so I'm hopeful we will have a good engagement. Thank you very much, colleagues. So I'll now hand over to the ambassador from Russia. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Your 15 minutes begin now.
Okay, thank you. Let me begin by saying what are the origins, what are the root causes of this crisis, as you call it, as the head title. I hope that participants had the possibility to get acquainted with the statement of the President Putin, which was made early in the morning on the 24th of February. Basically, I will repeat and maybe dwell on some of the issues he has raised, because he had said it all. The immediate cause for this action was the ongoing war in the east of Ukraine and the imminent attack of Ukrainian military on the unrecognized at that time People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. For 8 years, the Kiev regime has been killing civilians in Donbass, while the Western countries have been turning a blind eye on genocide that was taking place in eastern Ukraine. The figure of 15,000 civilians being killed that our Ukrainian colleagues and some experts like to invoke in this context that does not reflect the reality, because you have to explain it again. Well, first of all, UN documents speak about 13.1 thousand people killed in this latent conflict, of which just 3,000 are civilians. And most of these civilians are on the side of People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And the fact that shelling and bombing predominantly takes place from Ukrainian territory, from where the Ukrainian military and neo-Nazi and nationalist battalions are stationed, is proven by the OEC monitors that are present there. Please get acquainted with their reports, and though sometimes we have impression that they're blind and deaf, nevertheless, their reports reflect that fact, that most of the shelling comes from Ukrainian military. Now, for some reasons, I think that they are outside of the scope of our discussion here, the world media preferred not to talk about it, and the world audience mostly is unaware of this situation. But we in Russia, we followed that very closely, of course. There are about 4 million people living in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And during these years, beginning 2014, where an unconstitutional bloody coup d'etat took place in Kiev, and people in these regions refused to submit to the governance of the Kiev regime. Some violence was initiated there. So since then, about different sources, 600,000 to 800,000 people asked for Russian citizenship and became Russian nationals. And of course, we must provide protection to our nationals. Kiev, the government in Kiev has said on multitude of occasions openly that they are not going to implement Minsk agreements that were elaborated with some intermediaries and OEC participating. And that basically has left us with very little choice in this regard. Besides, as I said, we knew that the attack on the Donetsk and Lugansk was imminent, it was coming, and we had to preempt it. Of course, besides that, I can invoke a number of other reasons that Russian minority in Ukraine suffered some repression, and there were laws adopted prohibiting Russian language, Russian culture, Russian even pop music, Russian media, Russian radio stations, Russian channels in Russian language. Everything was prohibited. This is reason number one, the immediate reason, so to speak. There are other reasons, as there are security issues in Europe, and there are issues of strategic security that we discussed and tried to discuss many times with our Western, as we used to call them, partners. In particular, the issue of NATO expansion. This is one. The Ukraine becoming or striving to become a NATO member, but also others. NATO infrastructure for 30 years, it has been moving closer to Russia's borders, and we consider that as a direct threat to Russia's national security. We addressed both Ukrainians and NATO's countries on numerous occasions for almost 2 decades or so, or over 2 decades. But there was wave after wave of NATO expansion, despite the promise to Soviet leadership not to expand the bloc eastwards that was given in 1990 and 91. So we know that some NATO bases, military bases, installations were supposed to appear in Ukraine soon, naval bases, but also other military infrastructure. And we tried to solve this issue diplomatically by presenting 2 draft treaties on mutual security guarantees separately to the United States of America and to NATO on the 15th of December last year. The responses were that we have received basically said no, full of contempt, denial of any possibility even for Russian Federation to have any security reasons, and that they could be somehow taken into account. And then the last minute effort, diplomatic effort again on our part in January this year, when Minister Lavrov wrote letter to his counterparts in NATO member states. And he reminded about the principle that was negotiated in the OSCE for quite some time, and that was enshrined in its documents, in particular 1999 Istanbul Declaration and 2010 Astana Declaration, the principle of equal and indivisible security, which basically says that no state can ensure its security at the expense of the security interests of other states. Thus, diplomatic efforts have been lost, and we had to take that into account as well. And then, of course, going back to Ukraine, but from some other point of view, that's the desire of Ukrainian leadership to reacquire nuclear weapons, which has been announced on several occasions by President Zelensky. And the suspicion that we had, but now they are corroborated by the hard evidence that we are obtaining on the ground, that there were some secret biological laboratories deployed in Ukraine, and some research was going on obviously in violation of the Article 1 of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical and Biological Weapons. And so biological weapons were being worked on in these laboratories by Ukrainians, and with the assistance of the Defense Department of the United States, Department of Defense. So having in mind that Ukrainian government was and is under a heavy influence, first we think from abroad, and then domestically from neo-Nazis and radical nationalists in Ukraine, that also constituted a very dangerous element for us that we couldn't tolerate, because, well, you should understand, and everybody understands that. I hope that nuclear weapons and biological weapons in the hands of neo-Nazis and radical nationalists is a very, very dangerous thing to the world. And we saw how these viruses can be dangerous because we're still struggling, all of us, I mean humanity, we're still struggling with consequences of COVID-19 pandemics. Should I stop here? I think I have. I have some more time.
Ambassador, you still have 2.5 minutes. Okay.
That was a very difficult decision, as President Putin said. We had to do what we did. The operation is limited in scope. It is carefully tailored. Our military advanced very slowly and carefully, avoiding populated areas that slows down their progress. We take all precautionary measures not to destroy civilian infrastructure. And the best proof to that is the fact that all radio stations and TV antennas and channels, stations are operable in Ukraine. So the Russian troops do not go into the cities. They do not go into the residential areas. Unlike Ukrainian military and others, I mean Nazi battalions and nationalist battalions that have grown into regiments, rather, much bigger units, who place heavy weaponry in the residential areas, like heavy artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers. They are doing their best to make us attack residential areas, and they use residents of different cities and towns, in particularly in Mariupol, as human shields. These are purely terrorist tactics used by ISIL in Syria and other places in Afghanistan, and this really protracts the whole operation. But we will get there. The goals that were assigned to that operation by the president is to demilitarize and demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and we will do that. Okay, I think I can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was spot on, the 15 minutes. I appreciate that. We will now move across to Ambassador Pifer for your remarks on this topic. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Graham. With respect to the Russian ambassador, let me disagree with just about everything he's just said. First of all, this is a war. It is not limited in scope. It is not limited to the protection of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. 125 Russian battalion tactical groups, 200,000 Russian soldiers have invaded Ukraine. Thousands are dead, including thousands of Russian soldiers. There are 3 million Ukrainians who have had to flee Ukraine. And in fact, the Russian army is laying siege to Mariupol, Kharkiv, and is preparing to lay siege to Kyiv. This is the largest war in Europe since 1945. Let's be clear on that. This is also a war of choice. Ukraine presented no security threat to Russia. The Russian military had 4 times the number of personnel active duty as Ukraine. The Russian defense budget annually was 10 times that the Ukrainians spent. Russia had recently modernized its conventional forces, and Russia has 4,400 nuclear weapons. Ukraine has zero. Ukraine has zero in part because in the 1990s, when Ukraine had on its territory the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, Ukraine chose to give up that arsenal in large part because Russia, and I was at the negotiation, Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its independence, its territorial integrity, and Russia committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine, commitments that Russia has now grossly violated. The motives for the war that have been described, I think, are simply wrong. Moscow has tried to frame this as a dispute between Russia and NATO, but let me note that the last member in NATO to join the alliance that borders on Russian territory joined in 2004. In 2002, President Vladimir Putin signed an agreement with NATO, reinvigorating the NATO-Russia relationship, knowing full well that later that year, NATO was going to invite additional countries to join the alliance, probably including the Baltic states. Moreover, NATO put no military force or infrastructure on the territory of new member states until 2014, after Russia had used military force to seize Crimea and provoke a conflict in Donbass. And as the Russian government knows, the issue of NATO accepting Ukraine now is simply not on offer, particularly with Russian forces occupying Ukrainian territory. There have been a number of falsehoods that President Putin used to justify this conflict, and let me take them in turn. First, genocide. Let me point out, genocide is a term that gets bandied about really sometimes in a perverted way. The murder of 6 million Jews in World War II was genocide. The death of 4 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor in the 1930s was genocide. 14,000 people have died in the conflict in Donbass. That's a tragedy, but that's a tragedy that was begun because Russian security forces provoked a conflict there. Had the Russians stayed out, there would have been no conflict in Donbass, or it would have been resolved in a matter of weeks back in 2014. Second, the charge that neo-Nazis are in charge in Kyiv. Let me note that in 2019, in a runoff election, 73% of Ukrainians voted to elect a Ukrainian Jew as president. The previous prime minister of Ukraine is Jewish. So this nonsense about neo-Nazis there simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And then again, this charge that Ukraine seeks nuclear weapons. This has only been made in the last 3 weeks as part of the effort to justify this unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And again, the Russians have been able to not point out a single piece of evidence. To acquire nuclear weapons, Ukraine would have had to do several things, either build an enrichment facility for uranium, there's no evidence of that, or build a reprocessing center to reprocess spent nuclear fuel into plutonium. There's no evidence of that, and it's not been cited by any Russian to date. Let me get to what I think are the real reasons for the war. One, the Kremlin wants to have a significant say not only over Ukrainian foreign policy, but also domestic policy. And the Kremlin was concerned that Ukraine was slipping out of Moscow's orbit, and that was happening. But let me note that nothing has done more than Russian policy over the past 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, Russian support for the conflict in Donbass. Nothing has done more than that to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. I think there's also very much a second issue here at play, which is domestic politics within Russia. The Kremlin fears a Western-oriented, democratic, and economically successful Ukraine, because that kind of Ukraine would cause Russian citizens to ask why they can't have the same political voice and democratic rights that Ukrainians have, which they do not have in Russia. So for the Kremlin, this is actually an issue of regime survival. And then third, it's the particular aspect of Vladimir Putin, who gets quite emotional about Ukraine. If you either look at the February 24 speech that he gave, as the ambassador suggested, or go back and read the essay that he wrote last summer, you will see a person who basically denies Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign state and presents a distorted view of Ukraine's history that few historians would recognize. So these reasons, the Russian desire to have a say in Kyiv, its domestic concerns, these are not legitimate reasons for the war that we've seen. there was a chance to avoid this war. The ambassadors raised the 2 draft treaties that the Russian government provided in December. In fact, there were reactions from both the United States and NATO to say, look, we can talk about arms control measures, risk reduction measures, confidence and security building measures, transparency measures, things that we know how to do and the Russians know how to do. We did these in the 1980s, we did these in the 1990s, and they could lead to a genuine improvement in European security, including for Russia. But there was simply no interest on the Russian side in engaging. What the Russian government wanted was NATO to renounce any plans in the future forever to enlarge, even though that's embedded in the NATO treaty. And also they wanted that the NATO would withdraw forces from the territory of those countries that joined after 1997. And up until 4 weeks ago, the number of forces there, each Baltic country had maybe 1,000 to 1,200 troops, a relatively small force that had been deployed only after 2014 and Russian military action against Ukraine. So let me say, I think there is now a war, it's a war of choice. It is a wide-scale war. The goal there clearly was to take Kyiv and depose the government there. And it's not going well because the Russian government, the Kremlin, miscalculated. The Russian military has underperformed, and they're finding that the Ukrainians, who I think see this as an existential conflict, that is, they see both their democracy and their vision to become a normal European state at stake, and they are fighting with great tenacity and determination. Now, there, I think, is a role of diplomacy here at some point, but to date, unfortunately, the demands for a ceasefire presented by the Kremlin seem to be maximalist. It's recognition of Crimea as Russian, it's recognition of the 2 so-called people's republics as independent states, it's neutral status, but that neutral status hasn't been defined, and it's also demilitarization. And when they talk about denazification, that seems to be a code word for regime change in Kyiv. That doesn't leave a lot of room for compromise. Now, Kyiv and President Zelensky over the last 10 days have several times hinted that they are prepared to relook at their desire for NATO membership. They're prepared to talk about neutrality, but we haven't seen any positive reaction out of the Kremlin to that. And the question then becomes, if Ukraine were to accept some kind of neutrality, what would be the guarantee? How would Ukraine's security be guaranteed? Would Russia guarantee it in the same way that Russia made its assurance back in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum? Does neutrality extend to no NATO, or does it also include no European Union? In 2013, Russia had a Ukraine that was neutral. It was written into Ukrainian law that Ukraine would have non-bloc status, but Russia engaged and pressured the Ukrainian president not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. That's what triggered the Maidan revolution. So I think there is a possibility to see a role for negotiations. There would be a Ukraine-Russia track. We could get back to the ideas that were in the Russian draft agreements that the United States and NATO were prepared to talk about on arms control and risk reduction measures. And then a third track that could look at some sanctions relief for Russia. But it's only going to work if you can make that Russia-Ukraine track work. And that's going to require that the Kremlin drop its excessive demands and begin to get serious about a negotiation. And unfortunately, the signs over the last 2.5 weeks suggest that the Kremlin is much more interested in trying to win a military victory, which it may find that it cannot win. So I think I've used up my 10 minutes. Professor Graham, I'll stop there.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador Pifer, for your comments on this. And now we move across to our final speaker before we open up for Q&A, and that would be Prof. David Marples. Prof. Marples, please go ahead for your 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. My expertise is on historical topics. I do deal with politics as well. And I've been studying Ukraine for more than 30 years, so I think it's probably appropriate to discuss the background to this war from the independent period when Ukraine became independent and the relations with Russia in that time, because I think they help to explain where we are today. And I would go back, first of all, to the 1997 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation that was signed between Presidents Kuchma and Yeltsin. And that treaty divided up the Black Sea Fleet. It gave some conditions where Russian-speaking areas would be allowed to speak the Russian language. And at that time, it seemed that the relationship was fairly stable. I think that things began to get worse in 2004, when President Yanukovych, who was personally sponsored by President Putin for running for president, Putin campaigned on his behalf both in Kiev and Moscow. The second round of the election had to be rerun after the fabrication of the results, and Viktor Yushchenko became president of Ukraine. Thereafter, relations became quite difficult. And in fact, Dmitry Medvedev, who was president of Ukraine of Russia, between 2008 and 12, actually ended his personal relations with Yushchenko. Yushchenko also elevated as heroes of Ukraine nationalists who'd taken part in anti-Soviet actions during the Second World War, like Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevych. These were very controversial actions. Yushchenko also elevated the famine of 1933 as the defining event of Ukrainian identity, so that Russia from that point was perceived as very much the perpetrator or the other, since the famine resulted from orders made in Moscow. But it was really 2014, I think, that was the pivotal event that divided Russia from Ukraine. And there, I think it moved in several different stages. I think initially, Euromaidan was about Ukraine having associate membership of Europe, whereas Yanukovych at the last moment had taken the opposite direction and opted to join the Eurasian Economic Community, accepting a large loan from President Putin in making that decision. These demonstrations became more violent as they went on and eventually resulted in the departure of President Yanukovych, who fled ultimately to Russia. In that period of a presidency that followed, it should be noted that the elections did not elect neo-Nazis. They elected President Poroshenko, a definite moderate, an oligarch, someone who owned a business in chocolate manufacturing. And yet the relationship began to get worse from that time. In 2015, Ukraine introduced what were called memory laws, which eradicated the communist period from national history and made a list of what you call heroes of Ukrainian independence, or fighters for Ukrainian independence, which eliminated any communist participants in that. And that is the time when the names of the streets were changed, buildings, statues of Lenin were all toppled, and Ukraine proportionally had more of those than any other republic. And yet, in 2019, this direction simply stopped when Zelensky won a landslide election over Poroshenko, a neophyte political leader with no political background, an actor by training, and really, I think, elected on a promise to improve the Ukrainian economy, because between 2014 and 19, the Ukrainian economy had descended from being fairly middle of the road to the worst economy in Europe, lower than even Moldova. This was a big factor in Zelensky getting elected. Zelensky, when he first came into power, first Jewish president, he also greeted the first Jewish prime minister, Volodymyr Groysman, who eventually stepped down. So in no way could you say that neo-Nazis had taken over Ukraine. This was an absolutely unknown leadership. And the political party, the Servant of the People, again, invented on television rather than in reality, made up most of the seats in the parliament, in fact, got a majority for the first time. So there was no indication then, I think, in 2019 of a descending relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The question is, why did it suddenly get worse? And there are no obvious statements to make as to why the war started now. I mean, the situation in the Donbass has been of lengthy making. And the Minsk Accords, which were brought up by Ambassador Rogachev, yes, there are lots of problems with the Minsk Accords. There were problems with Ukraine fulfilling its mandate to give autonomy to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But on the other hand, those accords also specified that Ukraine should have control over its eastern borders, which it never did. In fact, wave after wave of trucks carrying who knows what came through from Russia in that period. And Ukraine simply had no power to stop things coming over that border. It didn't have control over those so-called republics in the eastern regions. These regions, regional powers in Donetsk and Luhansk, may or may not have been totally Russian controlled, but they would not have existed without Russian help. And ultimately, I would say that Russia was the key power in deciding who was going to run these so-called republics. Their leaders changed frequently. Many of them were assassinated without any reason as to why or who carried out this assassination. But without doubt, the leader in Donetsk today, Denis Pushilin, was appointed in Rostov prior to coming into Ukraine to take up this position. He is a native of Donbass, but on the other hand, he sees his future with Russia rather than Ukraine. These are obviously controversial opinions. And my opinion is that the Donbass is a very individual area of Ukraine. I visited there, and it was fairly obvious to me that this is a region that is not really fit into Ukraine, but it doesn't fit into Russia either. It has its own background, its own history, and it's a polyglot of different nations, speaking mainly Russian, but nevertheless with different interests that have gone from coal miners' strikes in the Soviet period to insurrection in the modern one. But nevertheless, legally, they are part of Ukraine. Today, we have a war between a nuclear power and a non-nuclear power. And one of the requests given at the beginning of this meeting was, what are the lessons to be derived from that or the previous wars? So I'd just like to make some final comments that relate to that question. There are many examples of wars between nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers. Let's start, first of all, with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which went on for nearly 8 years, where the Afghans eventually retreated into the mountains. But what you had in essence was a very unpopular government in Kabul, backed by the Soviets, and a massive Muslim population that didn't accept Soviet rule. It didn't work. Nuclear weapons made no difference to this campaign. Undoubtedly, the Mujahideen were given weapons from the West, and they turned it to their advantage. Another one is the US war, or US-led war in Iraq that started in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein from power. That was on the pretext, a false pretext, that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Saddam was removed, but that didn't end the war. The war has continued. My country, Canada, thankfully never joined in that war. But this was a war again that has no logical end, as long as there are guerrillas, as long as there are people supporting Iraq who resent this outside interference. And this is my opinion of the war today in Ukraine. It is opposed by virtually everybody in Ukraine. And I've been surprised by the unity of Ukrainian people and all residents of Ukraine in rejecting the notions that are coming out of Moscow as official reasons for launching this war. The ambassador said they'd avoided civilians. That's not the impression we get from the attacks on Mariupol, where hospitals, kindergartens, and other buildings have been destroyed. In Kharkiv, where I have many friends, buildings again ransacked and destroyed by bombs, by missiles coming from miles away. And this is a war also where Belarus has played a role as well, in that Russian troops invaded Ukraine from another so-called sovereign state, Belarus, whose national rights have been violated for that to happen. So this is just a background from me. I hope it was helpful, and I would be happy to answer questions on anything that I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Marples. I think that historical background was also very helpful for the conversation that we're going to have now. I think I just want to check if Prof. Landsberg is online. Prof. Landsberg is a full professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and SACHI chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And Prof. Landsberg, we're going to give you the floor for about 3 minutes if you'd like to weigh in with your point of view before we open up for Q&A. Prof, are you ready to speak?
I am indeed, Chair. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just build on some of the concluding comments by Prof. Marples there. I want to start with the theme of this excellent and important webinar. So the question is raised by the theme, the Russia-Ukraine war, escalation or détente. So let me have a crack at that question. Escalation followed by détente, but that will never lead to an entente. The antipathy between America in particular, NATO in general, and Russia, and I want to add China, a real bogey, in US and NATO foreign policy, but particularly the US, is long-standing, it's deep, it's not about to disappear. And in fact, it is that issue that has the makings of a fundamentally new world order, if you'd like me to put it this way, a post-Cold War order. NATO is certainly a bulwark for security in the transatlantic alliance and community, but a serious question must be raised. Is NATO a threat to international peace and security? Iraq was mentioned. From an African point of view, I would like to mention Libya. NATO, together with UN sanction, went in there and destabilized a country and a region. You are absolutely right, Professor Marples. The war in Iraq was uncalled for. Let me make a further point. Putin might have started the war, but NATO seemed to have triggered the war. There has been a long build-up here, and I couldn't agree more with Professor Mutambara that this war was inevitable. Another reason for the war is the insatiable appetite by NATO for global hegemony. The one characteristic of American foreign policy that has always struck me, it doesn't take kindly to rivals. It certainly doesn't take kind to a tripolar world. I agree with Ambassador Pifer that for Vladimir Putin, it has indeed become about regime survival, but for NATO, it has become about regime change as much as it has become about regime change in Ukraine for Russia. So we have the makings of a fundamentally new global order. We see the weaponization of the global financial system. And let me just end with 2 or 3 remarks about what it means for Africa and the South and the world more broadly. Those of us who fundamentally, and I'm one of those, believe in the multilateral order, better come together and make the case, galvanize the numbers, and make the case for a world in which real politics seem to making a real comeback. Important issues, including a virus, a global virus that we are contending with, seem to be pushed to the back burner, as will issues of aid, trade, and the like. In conclusion, it seems to me that it was the war in the making because NATO has been looking for a post-Cold War raison d'etre. It found that raison d'etre by trying to push the Western liberal order into the East flank and maybe even further afield. As for Africa, well, Africa doesn't seem to have a choice. Finally, Professor, if you look at the General Assembly vote by Africans, what it seems to suggest is that Africans are going to face stark choices. I couldn't agree more with Professor Marples that Ukraine is going to become a new Afghanistan, a new Libya. But in Africa itself, I'm concerned about proxy wars becoming the order of the day. We'll be forced to choose between Russia and America, Russia, NATO, China, NATO. Conditionalities will become the order of the day. And I'm waiting with bated breath to see how those countries who either abstained or voted against the resolution will be met with US draconian and punitive measures, lest they change their tune. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Landsberg, for your views on this topic. I think now we have time to open up for discussion. We have around 30 minutes for discussion. I'm going to select questions from the text and the chat And we'll also open up, if anybody from the audience would like to ask a question, please put up your hand and we'll get to you. I'm also going to ask that if you do ask a question through the hand function, that you'll keep your question short and sweet, and please stick to the topic at hand today. If you go over or go on too long, I will have to mute you so that we can hear a response at least from the panelists and move on to others who would like to ask a question today. I hope you understand that. And also please to keep your questions constructive and meaningful for this occasion and dialogue. So I think I'm going to start off with one question from the Q&A chat. And this question is directed, Ambassador Rogachev, to you directly, although I can ask the other panelists to weigh in too. And this is from one of our history professors here at UJ, who asks you, the ambassador, if you could please tell us more about the neo-Nazis in the Ukraine who seem to be so dangerous in Russia's view. Who are these people? How many of them are there? And why do you call them Nazis? That is one question. And I'm going to ask just one more question from the Q&A function and then open up to the panelists. The second question is from Remy Shawa, and Remy would like to basically ask the panelists about the operationality and functionality and value of security alliances in this day and age. NATO was founded for a very specific reason, as was the Warsaw Pact in a specific period in history. They're suggesting, should we perhaps consider strengthening the UN and ensuring that the Security Council is stronger and more representative of all regions, including the Global South, and perhaps doing away with NATO or other types of security alliances? Or am I being naive? Remy asks. Those are two questions that I'm going to put out to the panelists now. We will give you an opportunity to answer. Thank you very much. Let's start with Ambassador, the Russian Ambassador. Sir, please go ahead.
I do not think that comments of both panelists, Ambassador Pifer and Professor Marples, are helpful, because even in history, Professor managed to misrepresent things as much as they are completely misleading to the understanding of the current situation. And I can begin with the history of the present crisis that goes on with the year 2013 and even earlier. But the thing is that it was the Western position that put Ukrainians in front of a very tough choice, a very hard dichotomy, and which was at the same time completely false, that either you are with us or you are with Russia. Of course, it is possible for any country to have good relationships with many others, even with those who have different views on many issues of international agenda. But that was exactly the ideology that was put in the draft treaty on cooperation with the EU that Ukrainians had to make a decision about. And there was an effort on our side to make Ukrainian government to assess once again objectively the pros and cons of concluding such an agreement, as Ukraine gained quite a lot on bilateral relationship with Russia, in particular economic relations, which are still there. The volumes were shrinking, of course, during all these years, but bilateral trade is still there, and economic ties are still there. But in 2013, let me give you just this example. Half of the Russian budget for acquisition of military hardware was placed in Ukraine. Half of it. And this is a situation which can hardly be imaginable with any other country, beginning with the United States. So, of course, Ukrainians were about to lose a very lucrative deals with Russia, beginning with the military supplies. Now, the protests on Maidan were going down, were decelerating. And an agreement between President Yanukovych's administration, between President Yanukovych and the opposition was signed, if my recollection is good, in the evening of the 20th of February, 2014. And the next morning, that was about the redistribution of power and some political adjustments and so on and so forth. But just about 10 hours later, they were trashed by the opposition. And Poland, France, and Germany, whose foreign ministers were among the guarantors of this agreement, did nothing to prevent this from happening. And at a certain point, when the protests, the violence, let's say to speak, the temperature was going down of the protests in Maidan, some mysterious snipers appear who started shooting people in their backs. And that trick, this is a part of technology of regime change, which re-emerged again and again and again in different situations. And to my recollection, for the first time, I remember that happening in Vilnius in Lithuania in 1999. And then it happened many times and again in different countries, in different situations, in Syria, in the Tahrir Square, and so on and so forth. There was an influence from abroad. And when you analyze the protests on Maidan Square, you have to have in mind a very important thing, and not just this pro-democracy rhetoric, which is a smokescreen basically for what really was going on. Now, what was the question? I'm sorry.
There was one question related to who the neo-Nazis are.
Neo-Nazis, yes. The professor said that Poroshenko brought up, this elevated the status of certain individuals, prominent individuals in Ukrainian history who were some anti-Soviets, anti-Soviet ideology. This is not, again, the main feature. Shukhevich and Bandera both were Nazi collaborators, and they were treated after the Second World War as such. And now they have been promoted to the rank of national heroes. Streets and squares are renamed after them, and the highest Ukrainian state awards are named after them, and so on. There are torch marches that took place in Kiev. It is exactly what happened in the late 30s in Germany. And Ambassador Pifer could not having seen it. And these processions and marches of the veterans and followers of the SS division Galichina, which the members of which participated in Volyn carnage, first of all, when about 60,000 Poles were slaughtered, and many other mass murders and crimes against humanity. They march openly, and they are guarded by a police, which is revealing of a certain state policy in Ukraine. Now, talking about President Zelensky himself, I didn't say he is Jewish, well, but yes, he gained about 3/4 of voters, primarily because he promised to end the war in Donbass, and he promised to repel laws discriminating against Russian language and Russian minority, and he promised to to implement Minsk agreements. These are his main promises that he made during the electoral campaign. And his real policy was exactly opposite to the promises he made. He called in one of his interviews, he called people in Donbass, Russians in Donbass, species. And this is nothing but Nazism. His head of his administration, I think, or maybe his counselor on security issues, Arestovich, called Russians non-humans. They may be Jewish, but the ideology that they profess is Nazi ideology. And we do not care about their ethnic or religious affiliation. I'm sorry. This is about racism, and we are not following these footsteps. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to now open the floor to the other two panelists if they want to quickly weigh in on this, as well as a question around the future of security alliances like NATO, if it should be disbanded. And then we're going to move on to a question from the audience, a verbal question. Thank you, Ambassador Pifer and Prof. Marples, in that order.
I'll let Professor Marples address the history question, perhaps. 2014, Russia used military force to seize Crimea and then annexed it, and then used its military force and security services to provoke the conflict in Donbass, which claimed then 14,000 lives over the next 8 years. And then you then see NATO agreeing, in fact, to enhance its defense spending. And quite frankly, I think now this is one of the consequences of this conflict, is that NATO now has really galvanized, and NATO does see a purpose. NATO sees Russia as a military threat in a way that was not the case prior to 3 weeks ago. And I think you will see this will not be appreciated in Moscow, but you will see NATO taking steps such as reinforcing its eastern flank. You've seen the German government basically announce that it's going to dedicate 100 billion euros on top of its normal defense budget, defense spending, as NATO sees a Russia that has significant military power and has shown in the last 3 weeks that is prepared to use that military power for illegitimate political objectives.
Thanks, Ambassador Pifer. Prof. Marples?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to make 3 quick points. First of all, a comment on NATO. In 1990, there was a debate as to whether NATO had a purpose anymore, whether NATO could now be disbanded. And I attended a conference in Brussels on that question as a student, actually. And it was really debated quite widely whether NATO would have a purpose in the future. And there was some support for finding something as an alternative to that. I think one reason for the expansion of NATO, and it's not yet really been mentioned, is that the countries that asked for membership because they felt threatened. And I think that is definitely the case with the 3 Baltic states that joined in 2004. I mean, frankly, who are they threatening? The 3 Baltic states. They have a virtually population less than 10 million between them. And they're really not a threat to Russia and never have been, but they have been annexed by Russia at different times in the past, whether that's under the Soviet veil or Russian Empire. So I think that concern has to be brought up, but there are defensive reasons why countries want to join NATO. It's not simply a matter of NATO saying we're going to go further and further to the east. I thought the ambassador brought up some valid points, and I would say on 2 things. First of all, the agreement in February 2014, and second, the question of neo-Nazis in terms of the Bandera Shushkevich. And in fact, I've argued before on the memory laws. I was one of the first to criticize the memory laws, and I'm down in writing as having criticized those memory laws as an unwise way to go, because it simply meant that communist slogans of the past were then replaced by nationalist ones. Having said that, there's a lot of issues about Euromaidan that's never been resolved, and the snipers on the rooftops is one of them. No one's ever been brought to justice for those killings in the square. We don't know who these snipers were and what side they were on, to be frank. The ambassador is suggesting, I imagine implicitly at least, that these people were firing on their own people. And I've not seen enough evidence of that yet to suggest that that is correct. On the questions of the neo-Nazis generally, they form an infinitesimal part of Ukrainian society today. And for the most part, most people in Ukraine are simply not interested. Having said that, there are far-right groups everywhere in the world today, including in Russia, paramilitary groups that train in forests like Nashi, for example, which was encouraged by the government. And this is not simply throwing guilt around. We have them here in Canada too, and we certainly have them in the United States. Some of them supported the former President Donald J. Trump. This is a national phenomenon, but as yet, these people don't have enough support to actually take power in Russia, Ukraine, or in North America for that matter. So I'm not trying to deny that there were these factors to some extent in Ukrainian life, but to say that they're dominant, to say that they're controlling, or to accuse President Zelensky of being a racist, I think that's simply unfounded and far-fetched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Marples. We'll now hand over to Dr. Kueko from CACS at UJ. Prof, please go ahead. You have the floor for your question.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I wanted to piggyback on what Professor Chris Landsberg had said, and I think to me it's very important, which is really the core framing question of this webinar, which has got to be very clear. Russia-Ukraine crisis, escalation or détente. And while I find it very useful to hear the historical context of the crisis, I just find that it's a bit short for me because I didn't hear any clear answer coming, especially from the three panelists, the two ambassadors, and then Professor Marples. And for me, I would like to hear the following. What are, for example, the scenarios, best or worst case scenarios in détente, or if you want escalation that we should consider? Because for me, the foresight is more important now, what's next? And that for me is really important. And then most important, what do they mean for us here in Africa? And why should Africans really care? This is for the three, both ambassadors, and then Professor Marples. Thanks, Professor Graham.
Thank you very much, Doctor. So that was a double-barreled question. So I'm actually going to ask the panelists to respond to that. If you could respond to those two questions briefly, so we have room for more discussion afterwards, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So I'll open up for discussion now from the three panelists. Ambassador, if you'd like to respond to those two questions first. So the best and worst case scenarios around escalation or détente going forward, and what does this whole crisis mean for Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know from whose point of view the best and the worst case scenario, but I can tell you what's going to happen is that we're going to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now, after 3 weeks of this, I insist, pretty limited military operation, half of Ukrainian military infrastructure is already destroyed, and it will be destroyed entirely. I hope so. Now process of denazification is more complex, of course, but this is not something unheard of, and it already happened in human history. So there is a point of reference for us. Now, we hope that most of the population of Ukraine will support that. It is supportive so far. In many places, just as they got rid of the Nazi battalions and security apparatus of the present Ukrainian government. People are forthcoming and they really enjoy this new situation. If I may go back very briefly, though, on the issue of NATO, it is important to keep in mind that NATO bloc alliance was formed in 1949, and it had a very aggressive anti-Soviet, anti-socialist, anti-communist agenda. Warsaw Pact was put together only 4 years later in 1953, and it has been dissolved 30 years ago. So NATO since then has been looking for a raison d'etre, as it was said already, and now, of course, there is a pretext to increase military spending and so on, and that was one of the reasons why Ukraine has been hounded against Russia, and this conflict, this crisis was provoked and masterminded, and well, I just can repeat what has been said vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, that apply this thesis to Russia and NATO. NATO budget are many dozens of times larger than the Russians. Russia is no threat to NATO. NATO didn't need to expand eastward. There was a promise not to expand eastward, and I mean, yes, we realize that probably now it will be easier for Americans to make European partners pay their due 2% of the GDP to NATO budget, and they will be buying more and more American hardware, military hardware. But we do not think that this is beneficiary for Europe and peace in the world in general, for security issues in Europe and in globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. I think I'm going to ask Ambassador Pifer if you'd like to offer your comments on these two questions.
A couple of short comments, just one on the history of NATO. I'd just like to remind the ambassador that the reason that NATO was formed in 1949 was the Soviet army having defeated the Germans, and the Soviets did the bulk of the fighting to defeat Nazi Germany, but then the Soviet army did not leave. It stayed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria. But on the question of where this goes, I think the ambassador, if he truly believes that the majority of Ukrainians welcome the Russian invasion, that they see it as liberation, then he, like President Putin, thoroughly misunderstand Ukrainians. I was in Kyiv at the end of January, and people who had never served in the military were saying, if the Russians invade, I'm going to go get a gun and defend my country. The ambassador portrayed this as a limited scope. Look at what the Russian army is doing to Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and is preparing to do to Kyiv. This is a massive invasion. It is not limited in scope. And the reason that the operation is still ongoing is because the Russians miscalculated the depth of Ukrainian resistance. Now, where does this go? I think I see two scenarios. One scenario is that Russia, in fact, prosecutes this war to the end. And that could include things like going full Grozny, doing to Grozny, or doing to Kyiv what the Russian military did to Grozny during the Chechen wars, is basically leveling the city. And if mass and numbers are the way that Russia prevails, I mean, Russia has the advantage in both mass and numbers, so Russia might win this war. Russia will then find it's going to have to, for years, if not decades, maintain a military occupation of Ukraine with a hostile, angry population, in some cases armed. It will face political isolation, and it will face continuing Western sanctions. Now, the alternative, of course, would be for a negotiated settlement. I think we've seen in the last 10 days, President Zelensky has publicly put out some ideas where Ukraine is prepared to compromise, but as of yet, there's been no public recognition or response from the Kremlin that would lead one to conclude that a negotiated settlement is possible. But that certainly would be the preferred outcome, because it could save many, many thousands of lives, including the lives of Russian soldiers. But I think in terms of West-Russia relations, this has done huge damage. And I personally regret that. I spent 27 years in the American diplomatic service, and probably half of that was working on trying to improve relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then the United States and Russia. But I think after this brutal use of military power that we've seen by the Russians for reasons that are seen in the West as totally unjustified, relations between the West and Russia are going to be very, very cool for a very significant period of time. That's unfortunate, but I think that's the likely outcome, regardless of whether there's a settlement And that certainly is going to be the situation if Russia continues to prosecute this war.
Thanks, Ambassador. Prof. Marples?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Ambassador Pifer just said about the worst case scenario, and I think it is unfortunate. I would say possibly we may benefit in this war, and we've already seen this to some extent already, of intermediaries. And the most logical intermediaries, it seems to me, are Turkey, which has already played that role once, and China, because I think China is a power that really could be brought into this as a discussant and as a power that could really have an impact on dissuading Russia from further action and further slaughter in Ukraine. In terms of African countries, I would like to just bring forth just an idea that came to me, and probably it's come to others as well, but that is the role of the United Nations Security Council, which has always been stymied by the fact that it dates back to 1945 and the victorious powers of the Second World War. If, for example, that Security Council was on a rotational basis, so that all countries of the world got a chance to take part in it and have the veto power for the time that they're there, I think it would be a much fairer institution than something now that is increasingly dated and perhaps doesn't take advantage of the size of some of the populated countries that are not represented in it, India being the most obvious one, but the African countries as a whole could have a greater voice through that if the UNSC had real power. At the moment, it's become a talking shop where any way to halt this war, for example, is prevented because one of the members of the UNSC has the power of veto. And we've already seen that over and over. And even in the past, for example, when the Korean War took place in 1950, the reason why the UN could intervene there was that the Soviet seat was vacant. And this is just a fact. So that's just an idea, and I just throw it out there as a possible something to think about for the future, about how we discuss world affairs through the different nations in a global community, which we, as this webinar shows, we are a global community. We've got people here from all over the world, and this is an ideal way to discuss things.
Thanks, Prof. Marples. I'm going to ask the panelists if it's okay if we please extend the time just briefly to answer a few more questions, because we've come to the end of the Q&A session, but there are just one or two more that I'd like to pose to you, and if that's okay with you. Ambassador, thank you. So there's a question that is repeated often in the chat, so we'll avoid wasting time by just coming up with one kind of reduced question, and that relates to the question of international law and the territorial integrity of all states. And questions were raised about Russia and Ukraine and the US and Iraq and Syria, etc. So what is international law's role these days? Does it have a role to play, basically? Who gives another state the right to decide this kind of thing? So that's quite a difficult one for the panelists, but I'm going to give you the chance to respond to that. And then I'm going to, if you can just take note of that question, and then I'm going to quickly open up to Onward Machaka on the floor, if you'd like to quickly ask your question of the panelists. Onward.
Thank you, Professor Graham. My question, Professor, is mostly around the issue of the use of sanctions that does not follow anything from the United Nations. We have seen these sanctions also used in Africa, particularly in Zimbabwe. And one of the reasons why the sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe was lack of media, freedom of media. And we have seen of later, RT, Russia Today, being actually censored, and that is a cause for concern. And again, I think I want to echo the issue of strengthening the position of the United Nations. I think we need to have total reform of the United Nations, and our African leaders have been very strongly on the issue of the reforming of the United Nations Security Council, and that has not been done, have not been said, and we still continue to see the United Nations being ignored on a number of issues. And I think we need to reflect on the modern setup and move forward in light with all these kind of incidents. That is my core question.
Okay, thank you very much, Arnold. So I'm going to leave that now with the panelists. If you'd like to respond to both questions, the one related to international law and what does it mean for one state versus another state these days? And secondly, the question of the use of sanctions and their viability. So I think we'll again start with Russian ambassador.
Okay, thank you. Let me begin again with what Ambassador Pifer had said previously. I mean, about the Second World War, I think that was pretty unfortunate, what he mentioned. Yes, Soviet troops stayed in Europe, and I'm sorry that was contrary to his expectations, or I don't know, somebody else's expectations. But yes, Soviet Union borne the brunt of the fighting with Nazi Germany. And Soviet troops left Europe in 1990, 1991, but your troops stayed there, and they are still there. And they are still in Japan, and so on. What does that mean? I think that's not up to a representative of United States of America to lecture anybody on the brutal use of force. Not to mention Grozny, for example. I can cite dozens of names of places like Fallujah, Basra, and so on. The progress in Ukraine by Russian troops now is slow because we do not go into the populated areas, as I said, unlike American troops who had 60 days of bombing and shelling campaign, reduce populated residential areas to rubble, and then advance. That's the big difference. So going back to international law, yes, I've mentioned this principle that was negotiated in the OSCE that confirms that every state has the right to choose its alliances, including military alliances, but this right is not absolute. It is limited by the interests, security interests of other states. This is why this approach is called equal and indivisible security. And when this principle is not observed, is violated, then the state which security interests are disrespected has the right to provide for its security interests. And in doing so, Russia has invoked the right to self-defense according to the UN Charter.
Thanks, Ambassador. So, Ambassador Pifer?
Yeah, let me make 3 points. First of all, the ambassadors claim that the Russian military is not attacking cities. Just watch the news. Just watch the news. Russian missiles, rockets, artillery are hitting and killing Ukrainian civilians by the day, if not by the hour. Again, just watch the news. The second point on international law, I think, the key principles of international law, though, should be, and when you talk about state-to-state relations, respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. And the question of Iraq came up, yeah, if we were here to debate Iraq, I would agree. I think what the United States did in 2003 was wrong. It was a violation of international law, as well as probably the biggest blunder made by the United States since the war in Vietnam. But that doesn't justify the naked aggression that Russia is now committing against Ukraine. And again, the ambassador's invocation of the right of self-defense, no reasonable person would look at the size of the Russian military, the size of the Ukrainian military, and claim that what Russia is doing now is a war of self-defense. This is a war of choice. It's a war of aggression. And at the end of the day, on the question of sanctions, simply what Russia is doing is unacceptable. The United States and NATO have made clear they will not go to war with Russia over Ukraine. I think that's pretty clear. But they are prepared to take steps to make clear that this kind of action is unacceptable. And that has triggered the sorts of economic sanctions that have now been applied to Russia. And I would argue that, it's a tool that can legitimately be applied when you have a situation like this, and that it should be applied.
Thanks, Ambassador Pifer. And Prof. Marples?
Yeah, I think sanctions often, it seems to me, hurt the wrong people. And I've seen that happen so many times in the past. They're with a goodwill often imposed, but at the same time, they don't always have the impact that we hope they will. But the sanctions imposed on Russia are pretty harsh, but they are a better alternative than escalating the war. And I think in terms of NATO, Ukraine membership of NATO, this is something it's not on the agenda right now. I mean, it never was. And even though there was a so-called membership action plan back in 2008 with Georgia added as well, it would still have had to go through the usual procedures of NATO. And that is if any NATO state wouldn't agree with that. And it's quite clearly there are several NATO states who wouldn't accept Ukraine as a member. Then it is not really feasible for that to happen. So the sanctions are what happens if you're going to respond without going to war. And it seems to me, though they don't have the impact they should do, sometimes it's a reasonable way to respond. In terms of the organizations, the Russian ambassador brought up the OSCE. The OSCE's never really had much power, and it only pertains to certain states of the world. So I think in terms of the OSCE, it's never really going to resolve the problem. I mean, the OSCE also was monitoring the situation in the Donbass war for the past 8 years and having a very difficult time of it. I used to get its daily reports, and they were always complaining about both sides violating the ceasefire over and over and over again, but they couldn't do anything about it. And as I said before, I think that the UN is the place to be, really, if you're going to have a long-term solution. I don't think it really helps saying what happens in the past. I would agree with that. But I felt in Ukraine's case, it was worth talking about the history to explain where we got to where we are now. I mean, these are sort of footsteps along the way to what is really a very nasty war now. And I don't think there's much to explain why it's really taking place. It's a little bit like the war in Iraq. You can understand that there might be some reasons there, but there's nothing to justify what is actually happening on the ground. And the real impact of the war today is on civilians. It's not on governments, it's on civilians. And whether or not Russia is trying to hit military installations, to some extent it has done, they're hitting the people most of all. I mean, the people we're seeing coming out as refugees are people who have in desperate plight, the worst I've seen since the Syrian refugee crisis of a few years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Marples. We have one question again from the floor. I'm going to ask Dr. William and Prof, if you could please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Prof. My question is a quasi-comment rooted on the use of weapons of mass deception, where narrative supremacy is used to conceal rather than reveal the truth to the world, whereby superpowers, when fighting, seek to brazenly erase history, silence historical facts, and manufacture excuses for fostering war at the expense of what Professor Marples calls the wrong people that tend to be hurt. This whole war is based on old Cold War and post-Cold War tensions that can date back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And I think a resolution to this conflict that is taking place now can be benefited by taking notes from what the Premier of Russia at the time, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and the President of the United States of America at the time, President Kennedy, did to resolve that standoff. by looking facts in the eye and respecting security concerns of each other, respecting fears of each other, and acknowledging political and economic desires of each other. It is from that position of frankness and truth that conflict can be resolved, and that war can be avoided, and that the wrong people cannot be hurt. There is a persistence in the present by powers to try to be slippery, to be smart, by deploying what I call weapons of mass deception. If we don't retreat back to the facts, to the truth, to the fears and the desires of these powers, the wrong people will continue to being hurt. Thank you very much, Prof, for this opportunity.
Thanks very much, Dr. Marple, for your comments there. I think that we have time for potentially 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask this of the panelists, these final 2 questions. Is that okay, Ambassador Pifer?
I've got about 5 minutes more, then I've got to leave for another engagement.
Okay,
So-
then we'll keep this very, very brief. My final question then I'm going to pose to the panelists is simply this: is the threat of an escalation to a potential nuclear war a realistic one? I think I'll ask Ambassador Pifer to actually respond first, since you may have to leave.
Yeah,
first.
okay. Well, just to get to the previous question about the Cuban Missile Crisis. No, I think I think Russia does have some legitimate security concerns with regards to military forces and their location. But those were the sorts of issues that the United States and NATO said they were prepared to address, and the Russians showed no interest in that. Mr. Putin has expressed concern about American missiles in Ukraine that could strike Moscow within a matter of minutes. First of all, I don't think those missiles have been built yet. And the only person I've heard discuss their deployment in Ukraine is Mr. Putin, but that would be a legitimate concern. We can have that kind of discussion. And even in a negotiation, if Russia is prepared also to address European concerns. But thus far, Moscow has showed no interest. On the question of the nuclear issue, I really hope this does not escalate. It was, I think, somewhat irresponsible of the Russian president to start talking about a nuclear alert at a time when there was no threat of a NATO-Russia clash. I think it was designed to intimidate the West. And I am glad that the West responded in a fairly low-key way. And I'm also glad to hear reports from the Pentagon that they at least have seen no visible change in Russian nuclear force posture. So I think it's in the interest of both sides to avoid any nuclear escalation, and it's in the interest of both sides and the entire world to avoid a nuclear conflict.
Thank you very much, Ambassador
And
Pifer.
I apologize that I have to leave in a moment.
No, thank you so much for your time as well, and for your comments and your responses to the questions. I appreciate your openness. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank
Prof.
you.
Marples, would you like to quickly respond, and then I'll leave it to the Russian ambassador to finish?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Dr. Marple brought up a really valid point. And in 1962, the response of Kennedy was very low key. And I think the question then arises of spheres of interest, right? But we're really talking about here spheres of interest, which seems to me almost a 19th century phenomenon, but it's one that's been used by President Putin several times, that because Ukraine is located in geographical position to the southwest of Russia, then Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of interest. It's in its near abroad, and it's a former Soviet republic. My response to that would be, do we respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, and do we accept an independent Ukrainian state with the right to make its own decisions about what it does in its future? And I think that's been emphasized several times in different treaties. I mentioned one right at the beginning. There's also the Budapest Memorandum. There are several cases where you can point to agreements by Russia and other powers about Ukraine, including its security interests in the Budapest Memorandum with the United States and United Kingdom. I think in terms of things like weapons of mass destruction and using the nuclear threat, and whether there could be escalation, I mean, that threat's always there. It's always there. I mean, it's in the background all the time. If it wasn't there, I doubt this war would be continuing now. But it gives the power with the weapons that extra bit of leverage to continue doing something they probably shouldn't be doing. And I'm not even going to address all the comments in the chat seem to be about Americans being arrogant and throwing their weight around in the past. Maybe, but we're not talking about that in the specific interest. We're talking about Russia invading Ukraine. And I think I will use that verb invading without any reservations, because that's what it is. It's an invasion of a sovereign state by another sovereign state, just as Iraq invaded Kuwait many years ago, and the world was up in arms about that. And take that at face value. This is what is happening. A sovereign state has been invaded by another one. So spheres of interest to me is a secondary factor. And whether Ukraine exists in the future is the big factor now. And I think there are 44.8 million people who believe strongly that their state has a right to exist. And I would argue that that's a correct assumption. It does. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Marples, for your comments there. And now we will ask the Russian ambassador for your response to the nuclear question. Ambassador?
Thank you. Well, I'm very glad to finally have heard that Russia may have legitimate security concerns in Ukraine, and that's a way forward. This is a good starting point. Now, of course, the responses that we got from both United States and NATO to our proposal to conclude bilateral treaties on mutual security guarantees was completely unsatisfactory. This is why it didn't work. So, and then let's do not pretend that crisis in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is just a separate story, and nothing else has anything to do with it. No, and once again, no. It is a piece of a puzzle, and Russian security concerns vis-a-vis Ukraine could have been taken care of if we had some way forward, some willingness to negotiate with about these concerns on behalf of our Western former partners. That didn't happen, though, as well, no, and as I said. All missiles that can reach Moscow from the territory of Ukraine in a matter of 7, maximum 8 minutes are already built and exist. And formal membership of Ukraine in NATO is not a condition sine qua non that these missiles could have been deployed there. Apparently, Ukraine has a very big scientific and intellectual capacity, and they are capable of developing nuclear weapons themselves. They have kept this, they have preserved this capacity from old Soviet times. And the same goes to the vehicles that can deliver warheads, nuclear warheads, or biological weapons warheads to Moscow. Flight time from Ukrainian territory to Moscow is 5-7 minutes, as I said, maximum 8. Regular cruise missiles can reach Moscow. In this time, no air missile defense system can be deployed or get operational. Russia would have been completely defenseless in this situation. There is no way that we could have agreed to that. And we talked about that to Ukrainians themselves and to NATO for many, many, many years. One of the issues was why Ukraine would need necessarily to become NATO member or to have this very close military affiliation with NATO. There are many other ways to provide for your security. In particular, look at Finland, look at Sweden, look at Switzerland, and even one of the post-Soviet states, Turkmenistan, enjoys fully its neutral status. There have been ways to prevent this. There is a way forward that Russian and Ukrainian teams now negotiate. Negotiations take place every day. now in DCR format, and we hope to get there. We hope that in the future, two countries, we will not become divided by a sea or ocean. You know, we will have to live together still, and we will live together. And in Russia, Ukraine is seen as, and Ukrainians are seen as a brotherly nation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm now going to end the Q&A session. And before I hand over to the closing speaker, Dr. Teller, I just want to offer my own personal thanks to the three panelists for freely expressing your views and perspectives on this topic at this event. I'm grateful for that. Thank you so much, and for your time tonight. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Teller, who is the head of the Future of Diplomacy at UJ's Institute for the Future of Knowledge. Dr. Teller, over to you.
Many thanks, Professor Graham. First and foremost, I would like to express my appreciation to our distinguished panelists for their excellent and thought-provoking presentations. I would like to convey special thanks to the chair for her adroit and admirable chairing. My deepest gratitude goes to my colleagues at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for the Future of Knowledge and the library for their unwavering support towards the success of this event. Finally, my deepest thanks goes to the participants for their intriguing questions and fascinating interventions in this first meeting of our series on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Please watch out for our upcoming event on this topical issue. In my capacity as the head of the Future of Diplomacy Research Group, I thought it worthwhile and useful to highlight the key ideas that have emanated from this event. While COVID-19 had dominated global news in the past 2 years, there is no gainsaying the fact that it has now been overshadowed by the Russia-Ukraine conflict as the world trembles at the thought of the possibility of a nuclear holocaust and World War III. To our students of international politics in this meeting, the Russia-Ukraine crisis presents a quintessential example of a realist interpretation of international politics, characterized by an anarchic international system, a security dilemma, and a self-help system. The main takeaway for me is that the crisis presents a catch-22 situation. While Kyiv wants to be able to determine its own security alliances, Moscow emphasizes the risk such action poses to its national security. Indeed, this is a case of security dilemma that can only be resolved by mutually beneficial agreement. Whether we admit it or not, Russia and Ukraine are joined at the hip to guarantee peace and tranquility in Europe and by extension across the globe. As the old saying goes, it is better to judge war than war. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events.
Everyone, thank you very much for this great event. We now close this session.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.